Neoliberalism completely devastated Chile, impoverished the masses, privatized the economy, allowed the first world imperial core companies and corporations to not only get the Chilean people into debt, to force them into debt, but also to extract their resources in a very parasitic way.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
I think it's important to give an overview of what neoliberalism is and how it applies to Chile, because we hear the term neoliberal being used a lot and we hear neoliberalism very frequently in media, and a lot of us aren't really sure what it is. I myself am still grappling to fully understand what neoliberalism is, but I just want to give everybody an overview based on my understanding of what it is and how to combat it. So within economics, there are four general schools of thought. There obviously are more, but these are the general sketches of economics that are prevalent in the West. We have classical liberalism that was inspired by economists like John Locke and Adam Smith and Ricardo, The Wealth of Nations. This is the original capitalism that came about in the 1700s, 1800s. The Wealth of Nations was actually published 1776, same year as the United States. And this is what is defined as classical liberalism, the free market, individual rights, all of that. And this is different from neoliberalism, neo meaning new liberalism, in the sense that neoliberalism promotes more of a state role, but the state doesn't interfere in the market or what it defines as the free market, but the state is used as a way to impose the free market. So a great example is Chile, and I think that's why we're having this discussion now, because Chile was the breeding ground, was the scientific lab for neoliberalism, where they used the state forcefully in a dictatorship to impose the free market the way that Pinochet did. Because classical liberals like Locke, Adam Smith, Ricardo, even though we know what they were saying was complete bullshit, they were slave owners, they supported some of the most horrendous acts of colonialism, they still at least pretended to promote liberty and individualism. And that's where we get a lot of the libertarians, right, who believe in minimal state intervention, both in the political and in the economic. Neoliberal economics is more focused on the quote unquote free market, the invisible hand, but they believe in using the state forcefully to impose that. So it's even more vicious, I would say. Then the other two schools of thought within economics are Keynesianism, inspired by John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist. And Keynesianism is also capitalist. Let's not get it twisted. Keynes was in favor of capitalism, but he was more on what in the United States, what we would call liberal or democratic, where he wanted a kinder and gentler face of capitalism. He wanted more state presence, right? I think somebody who exemplifies Keynesianism is FDR in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who wanted to maintain capitalism. He didn't want to give the means of production, the wealth of society, back to the workers and the peasants. He wanted to keep it in the hands of the capitalists, but he wanted to have social programs that maintained the people from rebelling. And Keynesian economics has become very popular in Western Europe, especially in a lot of the social imperialist countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, that I still consider to be imperialist, that are still capitalist, but have more social programs, right? They'll have things like universal healthcare, they'll have education, free education and stuff like that, but only for their domestic population. Meanwhile, they're still invested in war, banking, and all of these things that are within the imperialist order. And lastly, of course, we have Marxism, socialism, which believes that the means of production, the wealth of society, the factories, the roads, technology, everything that is produced by humans and workers should be owned. The wealth of society should be owned and managed by those who produce it. And this is called socialism. This is the economic system that we promote. And that eventually transforms into communism over a period of time through the construction of socialism, through nationalizing industry, through uplifting workers. And in Chile in 1970s, you had a battle between both of these forces. Obviously, Salvador Allende was a Marxist. He was ushering in socialism with the Unidad Popular coalition from 1970 to 1973. So he was president for just 3 short years, very short period of time. In those short 3 years, he accomplished many great things. His Unidad Popular in general, the Popular Unity Coalition, we're talking about 12% industrial growth in the country. So unleashing the capabilities and development of Chile, 8.6% increase in GDP, gross domestic product, a major decline in Chile's chronic inflation. He brought inflation down from 34.9% to 22.1%. Inflation being that the cost of goods, the cost of buying things in everyday life, milk, food, gas, inflation is when the prices of commodities go up. So the value of a currency goes down, basically. He brought inflation down. So that helped the working class people of Chile. Unemployment, he brought it down to 3.8%. US right now, as it stands, has a higher unemployment rate than Chile did under Allende. So socialism was employing people, giving government jobs to the masses. Nationalization of copper, which is one of Chile's biggest commodities, one of its most valuable industries that helped lift millions of people out of poverty. Universal healthcare, land redistribution, food programs for the poor, and wage and salary increases for the most oppressed in Chile. So within these 3 short years, very short period of time, right? He was able to implement all of these things using the Marxist economic model of socialism, of bringing the power back to the people. Now, contrast this with Pinochet's dictatorship, which lasted from 1973 to 1990, long period of time. And again, as Chris mentioned, Pinochet came to power in a U.S. coup. Thousands and thousands of people killed in Chile, mainly working class people, activists, indigenous people, brutally tortured, man. I don't even want to go into how crazy that time period was, especially 1973. But you have people like Víctor Jara, who's one of Chile's most amazing musicians, one of my favorite musicians, who had his fingers cut off and tortured in a stadium. You had Pablo Neruda killed. You had so many countless people who were killed during this time. Also, the rise of revolutionary socialist movements in Chile, but so many of them were repressed. So from 1973 to 1990, right-wing neoliberal dictatorship, right? You have immediately everything rolled back, all of the progressive gains made under Allende, everything was privatized, everything was taken back to the corporations who had been kicked out. And check this out, under Pinochet, wages decreased by 8%. Family allowances in 1990 and 1989 were 28% of what they had been in 1970. So that's a huge drop, right? Almost by the end of Pinochet's dictatorship in 1989, the family allowances were 20% of what they had been in 1970. Budgets for education, health, and housing had dropped by over 20%. You had these huge international banksters, I like to call them, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, that got the country into millions and millions of dollars into debt, controlling them. Because when you get a country into debt, you're able to control their future. And as a result, you have privatization, schools, education, housing, hospitals that were privatized, no longer accessible by the majority of the people, only a small, wealthy elite. And you have multinational corporations like International Telephone and Telegraph, Dow Chemical and Firestone, and all of these copper extracting companies coming in to privatize the economy. So all of the wealth and resources of Chile is a very wealthy country in terms of natural resources. It has the ability to feed and clothe everybody with the resources there. All of that was taken, extracted, sent to the imperial core countries as part of this imperialist process. And by the end of Pinochet's reign, about 44% of Chilean families were living below the poverty line. So long story short, neoliberalism completely devastated Chile, impoverished the masses, privatized the economy, allowed the first world imperial core companies and corporations to not only get the Chilean people into debt, to force them into debt, but also to extract their resources in a very parasitic way. So this just shows the evil, parasitic nature of neoliberalism, of imperialism, of capitalism that builds its wealth from the exploitation of people in the global south.